sing, 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 sing. Everybody start to sing. La-di-da, ho, ho, ho. Now you're singing with a swing. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Welcome to this special edition of Italics, television for the Italian-American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. This episode is the second of our 8th season of month-long special programming celebrating October as Italian Heritage and Culture Month here on CUNY TV. Each October, New York State celebrates Italian heritage and culture. What began as Italian Week has grown into a month-long itinerary of numerous events spanning the city, state, and country, drawing in international participants and arguably having become the largest celebration of all things Italian anywhere in the world. This edition features Maria Laurino and a discussion with distinguished professor Fred Gardefei. Here with us in our studio, Maria Laurino began her career as a journalist at the Village Voice, where she covered local and state politics and social issues, such as New York's exploding housing market and the resulting surge in its homeless population. In 1989, she left the Village Voice to become the chief speechwriter of New York City Mayor David N. Dinkins, serving until the end of his term in 1993. After leaving government, Laurino returned to freelance journalism, writing for numerous publications, including the New York Times. Her first memoir, Were You Always in Italian?, was a national bestseller and explored the issue of ethnic identity among Italian Americans. Her second memoir, Old World Daughter, New World Mother, examined the pull and tug the author experienced between Old World traditions that valued familial dependence and a New World feminism that prized female autonomy. She recently completed the companion volume that will accompany the eponymous 4-hour PBS documentary, The Italian Americans. Maria, welcome to Italics.
Oh, thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me today.
So let's start backwards. Let's start with today. You've recently completed this book entitled The Italian Americans, which, as I just mentioned, is the companion piece to the 4-hour documentary. Tell us about it.
Oh, well, it was a great project. It was such a fun project. I said as I was writing it, I was going to be nostalgic as I was actually writing it because it was a wonderful opportunity to explore the Italian-American experience. And John Maggio, who's the filmmaker, did the 4-part PBS series, had asked me to write this companion book. It gave me the opportunity to expand a little bit more, hopefully more than a little bit, on what could be covered, even in something as in-depth as a PBS documentary. A book can always go further. So my book follows very closely each part of the documentary, which begins in 1860 and goes to the present day.
What were some of the challenges in writing this book? For me, I would think there would be two. One, you have this film you have to follow, and in some cases add some stuff. But also, there have been a good number of these books that have come before. Not necessarily the same, but these sort of general histories, right? Mm-hmm. So how did you negotiate those two different?
For the first one, I considered the documentary the kind of scaffolding, which was actually very helpful to me in creating the framework for the book. And with that, it just allowed me to just really get, try to get a little more meaty things in each of the chapters, because as I said, even a 4-hour series can only cover so much. For example, beginning with Italian unification, I read extensively on Garibaldi and the whole Southern problem and issue, and just allowed me to take the material and try to bring it a little bit further, covering some points that weren't covered necessarily in the documentary. In terms of the second part, yes, there's a wealth of wonderful books. La Storia is the first one that comes to mind. But in a way, this was different, I think, because of the documentary experience. We wanted a book where people could read it cover to cover or dip into it and be a little serendipitous. And because there were an interesting group of people who were interviewed for the documentary, it allowed me to have some fun, including interviews. I decided to come up with 3 additional parts, including, in addition to the chapters. One called Our Ancestors, which allowed me to give a deeper biography of people in the show. So, for example, Giuseppe Petrosino, who was a wonderful crime fighter in the early 1900s. I wanted readers to know more about him. I wanted readers to know more about Ettore Toscanini and what he did in his anti-fascist activities and how important he was. So Our Ancestors provided that opportunity to do these short bios. And then we also did something else I called I Nostri Paesani, which was, there were these wonderful interviews with writer Adriana Trigini, David Chase, the creator of The Sopranos, actor John Turturro, author Gay Talese, Dion DiMucci gave another wonderful interview. And I culled those transcripts and put some of those short interviews into the book.
Yeah.
And then we also had a section that just had some wonderful documentation. I call it a documenti, and some of them were period pieces. Some of them, it's a color book, and it allowed some sort of beautiful illustration. So, for example, Via More, whose work I think is really wonderful, we were able to include some of her art when we talked about immigration at Ellis Island, or we included original documentation of, I wrote about the poet Arturo Giovannitti and some of his correspondence at the time.
It's great that you wrote about Petrosino, Toscanini, and Giovannitti, because these are 3 major figures in the history of Italian America and in the history of America, right? And yet, we don't know about them as well as perhaps, or as much as we should.
Yes.
Right? And especially someone like Petrosino. Most Italian Americans, I would suspect, really don't, if you're not from the Northeast,
right,
you don't know who Joseph Petrosino is. You don't know there were in 1909, there were 250,000 people at his funeral.
Right,
right?
exactly.
In New York City. I mean,
right.
These are the things
lining
that,
up Fifth
right?
Avenue,
Yeah.
yes.
Or Toscanini, that he spent he's not just, quote unquote, an Italian, he's an Italian American.
Right.
Spent so much time here. And also Giovannitti.
Right.
For his social activism. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that was so wonderful to me, and I think sort of frustrating too, for those of us who cover this, and you do so much of this at Calandra, is why we don't know these figures.
Yeah.
Arturo Giovannitti was an incredible poet and leader, a labor leader, and he was his wonderful actions in trying to help the striking workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, textile workers in 1912 was so fundamental to the early labor movement in this country. So the question is, and John Maggio and I talked about this all the time, why don't we know our history? Italian Americans have to know our history. So I'm feel very grateful that PBS has done this to give this kind of exposure. And the catchword that I always think of for myself is our history is ourselves.
Yeah.
That we really can't fully understand who we are as hyphenated Americans, specifically here Italian Americans, until we really understand the depth and breadth of our history. Well,
I think this combination of film book is really significant because it really gives us in the academy, not just in college, but even in high school, because there are a lot of progressive high schools out there that allow to go beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? The opportunity to use both the written word and the visual to show this history. And in fact, the producer, Jeff Bieber, has spoken about this, trying to create some sort of a lesson plan, nothing necessarily all that entailed, but just using this as yet another platform for that, and I think that would be good. Let me ask you about your second book, because your first book was, I don't want to say traditional. When I say traditional, it's not by any means, critical, but it followed a certain paradigm, I think, that telling the Italian story, et cetera, right? But your second book instead spoke to gender. And we know it was well reviewed, whatever, but what were the reviews off the page?
The second book was really hard to write. And sometimes people say second books are just hard to write. But one of the reasons why it was so hard to write was because when I began it, I wanted to write this book about feminism, how I felt that feminism was failing women when it came to child-rearing issues, because we don't have the kinds of policies we need in this country to help women. But I was leaving out the ethnic part. because I felt with Were You Always an Italian, it was a series of interconnected personal essays on identity and ethnicity. I thought, well, I had talked about that, and now I'm going on to something else. And I was about 150 pages into the book, and it was going nowhere. And it occurred to me, well, wait a second, who I am ethnically is so important to how I see this issue. I mean, the Italian mama, what is stronger than that? And what I realized, and the title of the book ended up representing Old World Order, New World Mother, was, well, of course I was going to have a different response to feminism, because I grew up in a very traditional Italian family where there was a certain, and I rebelled against it, saying, no, I don't want this life. I want to go off and, have a career and work. And it wasn't until I became a mother that I realized, well, there are things from this tradition that are worth saving when it comes to child rearing. But I think maybe because it had this ethnic bent, I think it was hard for people to, I don't know. I mean, there wasn't a discussion about it in feminist circles in the way that I was hoping.
Yeah.
It was much more women, Italian-American women, and also Spanish women, Spanish-American, who wrote to me and said, wow, I could really relate to this. But in terms of sort of the larger feminist discussion, that was one of my frustrations, that it didn't enter that.
But the Italian community, it's interesting because you said in the Spanish community, because here we're dealing now also with religion, perhaps, to some degree. Catholicism, whatever that might mean, however that might influence motherhood in any way, shape, or form,
That's
right?
true.
But we're also dealing with Mediterranean culture as
Right,
well,
right.
Because basically, whether even Latin America has a Mediterranean influence.
And I think it's just traditional cultures too, like Caribbean American women. You really probably couldn't argue that's an old world culture, but they had many of those same traditions of you take care of the young and you take care of the old. And that's a very important part of the culture. And what I was trying to argue in that book is that Americans think dependence is such a bad thing because we're all about independence. And Italians think dependence is kind of a good thing. I'd like to say interdependence.
Yeah.
But, I used to joke that, my mother used to always say to me, you're getting really independent. And that was not a compliment. That was a, wait a second, you're leaving the home too much here. So there is a real tension among us hyphenated Americans, hyphenated Italian Americans, of, how wanting to embark and leaving the home, and knowing the tension in that, and also the lack of help with the government in terms of creating those kinds of environments where we can take care of the young and take care of the old without feeling tremendous burden.
Yeah. We are of that generation, right?
Yes.
Now, what about the next generation? Because this comes up all the time with the idea of identity and things of that sort. As you know, the Clandor Institute the last couple of years have been involved in these discussions with, sponsored by ILICA, with 4 Italians and 4 Italian Americans. And we had included Robert Viscusi, Luisa Ermelino, Donna Chiorco, who's a professor with us at CUNY, and Fred Gardafe, whom you know, and who's also a professor with us at CUNY. And we talked about the question of identity in 2 ways, one across the ocean, but the other one was generational. And so what do the 20 and 30-year-olds, right, how do they identify themselves? We did, of course, at the Clandor Institute, the Guido Symposium.
Right, which is very interesting.
Got us a little bit of press, most of it good, but and a few reactions. And, that whole idea of the manifestation of the younger generation being different, they have, in some cases, they have absolutely no idea about Toscanini and Giovannitti and Petrosino, whatever, but they're Italian. And what does that mean, right, for them to be Italian? I don't know. Has that come up at all in some of your discussions with the second book? And also, you have children.
Right. I have one son who's a senior in high school. So I have to think about that, leaving the nest. And he's half Italian. My husband is Jewish. And so we talk and kind of joke about it all the time, because Italian culture, because I write about it and think about it, has become such a big part of, our lives, my professional life and our personal life. And I think because of that, my son connects very strongly to that Italian culture in a really positive way. And what I think is wonderful about that, for this, he'll be 4th generation, is I do think they have less baggage than we do. And I think that helps them be less threatened by stereotypes and be sort of more confident in the culture. And
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about this a lot when I was writing The Italian Americans, this book, because, for one, the documentary and the book begin with the story of Roseto, Pennsylvania, which is a very interesting story,
Yes.
where Roseto was this completely homogenous Italian American community from the late 1800s on. And in the 1960s, two doctors came in to study Roseto because they discovered that they had a lower rate of heart disease than the rest of the country and the rest of the neighboring areas. And what was so interesting about it wasn't the Mediterranean diet. We all like to say the Mediterranean diet is life-saving, but unfortunately, the people of Roseto had already adopted the American diet, or maybe fortunately, it didn't seem to bother them. So they cooked with lard instead of olive oil. Their pizza was not the Italian pizza bianca. It was pizza with sausage and pepperoni and all that stuff. But still, they had this very low rate of heart disease. And when the researchers came in, they decided believed it was not genetic because they traced Rosetans in another part of the country. It wasn't doctors or hospitals because they shared the same with the neighboring towns. So what was it about this community? And what the doctors found was that it was this cohesiveness, that they were this very strong identity in terms of their Italian American culture, and they supported each other. And there wasn't a lot of competition. People decided that they wanted houses to mostly look the same, so you couldn't really tell who was wealthier and who was not. And this supportive environment created this kind of amazing community. But the doctors predicted that once the children started to leave, the nature of the community would change, and they were right. And when they came back and did the study 20 years later, the Rosetans had the same rate of heart disease as everyone else. So that question, these questions kind of frame the book for me. In that, what do you lose and what do you gain by leaving the old world and adopting the new world culture? You know, Americans, we're not going to give up geographic mobility. And there were other things about Roseto that also made it carried traces of the medieval Southern Italian culture. You know, they believed very strongly in the evil eye. And one of the reasons why there wasn't a lot of competition was because they were terrified
that people would curse the others.
Exactly, curse the others. So, you know, we're not going to have that today. But I think those questions are really interesting, you know, for us to ask and for younger generations to ask. And one of the things I was trying to do with the book is to say, you know what? We can really easily get nostalgic, and nostalgia doesn't help us. We have to be very clear-eyed about our history. We have to see what's incredibly positive. We also have to recognize that there's dysfunction, too, from a culture mired in poverty from southern Italy. So let's try to honestly look at it and then figure out, what can we preserve?
Yeah, I think you're right on with the nostalgia issue. I think that nostalgia can be great. We look back, we can revel in it, but then we need to use it to figure out how to move forward, as opposed to using it to block us from moving forward. And I think that that's when it becomes a sort of depressive, oppressive, you know, type of thinking. When you talk about Roseto, I remember that because I was just beginning to drive around that time. And I would take my grandfather to the liquor store to buy his cases of red wine. And I remember everyone was talking at that time about, well, because they all drink red wine. Red wine's good for the heart. And I was actually hoping that would be the case, but it turned out that wasn't the case.
Let's just say it is.
I know, so we could have another. Exactly. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your experience as an Italian-American woman becoming a professional. You're a journalist, working for a progressive newspaper, and then you become a speechwriter for David Dinkins. And I didn't mention in the interview, you're also a speechwriter currently for another elected official.
That's true.
Who is a paisano, Andrew Cuomo. How has that been for you as an Italian-American woman, as a woman, of course, but as an Italian-American woman, because you did have those pulls and pushes. You know, you're going from a nice Italian-American traditional family to writing for the Village Voice. I mean, did someone say, really, Marie, you're going to do that, really?
Well, my parents were always pretty supportive in that sense. They knew I really wanted to be a journalist, and they knew I really wanted to come to New York. And they were, they never quite knew what to make of the Village Voice. But they were very happy when they saw my byline, so in that sense. I just, you know, I guess I was just kind of really pushed myself from a very young age. And I think, and I was just very lucky to work with people who were mentors and who kind of took me on and gave me the ability to go on in those professions. And I think that sometimes the issue of Italian American identity was actually more subtle in terms of how I was trying to deal with myself professionally. This may sound like a silly story.
But you had this name, Maria Laurino.
Yes, yes. Well, when I was in high school, before I dealt with my, I think the great thing about writing is that sometimes when you write, you can kind of deal with some of these issues. And Were You Always in Italian was really helpful for that, to really talk about how I wanted to have my parents change their name when I was young, and what were some of the reasons for that. There seemed to be too many vowels, and of course today I love the name, and I wish I could say it well enough. That's the problem, I can't roll my R's. So so I dealt with that during the course of my student years, and I went to college during a time where this, was kind of hard to believe, but friends would say to me, if you saw an Italian American who was prosperous, they'd look at you and say, oh, you think they're in the mafia?
Connected.
It was that
kind
of stuff.
In Connecticut, the phrase was connected.
Yeah, really just awful. And how do you respond to someone like that? We had to deal with that baggage for a long time. Yeah. And so I used to be very protective and sort of secretive of the culture, especially until I wrote Were You Always in Italian. And just a silly example, but one that comes to mind is I remember when I was at The Voice, my mother used to make taralli, which we called tarals, and I loved them, and I would bring them to work to eat. I'd snack on, and I gave some to my colleagues. But I was always afraid to tell them. What was I going to say? These are tarals. It's like only Italians know this. And I remember having that this exchange with someone once, which showed my own ambivalence and how destructive that could be, where I said, why don't you have one of these? And he said, oh, what are they called? And I said, oh, it's kind of an Italian bagel. And he said, yeah, but what's its name? I said, well, it's kind of like an Italian pretzel. And he said, but it must have a name. It must have a name, because you're a journalist, wants to know what the name is. So I realized that there were parts of myself that I felt I couldn't share because of stereotypes that have been, very, unfair.
There's another aspect to that, in the sense that, because I had a similar experience with another food product, but that today you can't afford the taralli.
Exactly. You go to Italy and it's like,
they're like so much a pound. Right? That has been, I guess, a really sort of, not a shock, let's call it a shock, that over the years, all of a sudden I woke up one day and it was like, wait a second, we used to eat that 3 days a week and say again, now it's like $25 a plate, and we're dealing with pasta. And it's like, wait, when did that happen?
Right.
When did my grandmother's, again, pasta become $25 a plate?
Exactly. And how healthy the Mediterranean diet is. The food went from shameful food to superfood. And all of a sudden everybody wants the Mediterranean diet. But yes, I agree with you. And I think especially for our generation, that was a real shock when all of a sudden Italian was becoming chic. And we weren't used to that. I would argue that first it was the northern culture, but now I think it's both northern and southern.
Both. I think you're right. I just think in the early 70s, the big Italian restaurants, except for something like Giambelli's, which closed recently, and which was very expensive, but the big Italian restaurant was Mama Leone's in New York.
Right.
People used to make trips into Manhattan from Connecticut to go to Mama Leone's. And of course, today, a Mama Leone's would be hard pressed to make it. And you look at all the restaurants today, the Italian restaurants in New York, and we go to Europe, go wherever we go outside the United States, and people say, well, what's American food like? And sort of scratch your head and say, I think like half of it's Italian.
Exactly. That's what I eat.
You go to Nebraska and there's an Italian restaurant somewhere. From the culinary point of view, we've made great strides.
That is true. I remember this one story that always sticks with me, and I wrote about in Were You Always in Italian, where my father, years ago, to support himself, he was a caddy at an exclusive golf club that restricted Italians and Jews.
Yes.
And he used to want to pick dandelions or chicory, for the family meal. And he would do that, when he was finished with work. And he had this really mortifying experience when one of the golfers looked at him and basically said, oh, you people eat grass?
Yeah.
So, and of course
Yeah.
today you're going to have a dandelion salad in
Yes.
a Mario
And
Batali
you're gonna have
restaurant, and it's going to be
broccoli di
delicious.
rapa, which, you know, whatever. Yeah. I mean, we grew up eating broccoli di rapa. Now it's $15 as a side dish in a restaurant, and you sort of, you know, smack your forehead and go, really? The other thing I wanted to ask you was, you scored big with your first book, Norton.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That was nice.
and of course you're still with Norton. That's an accomplishment, right?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, all of these things are usually mostly luck. And I think one of the things that was very helpful when my first book came out was, and this was just completely a coincidence, was that The Sopranos was on TV. And when The Sopranos first came on, I had this resistance to it, you
Yeah.
know, this notion of, oh, a mobster on Prozac,
Yeah.
just what the world needs. But my husband started watching it. It was so long ago. I was putting my son to bed those years, and I didn't see it, and he said to me, oh, this is really compelling television. And you should watch it. And I started to watch it. And so many of the issues on The Sopranos dealt with social issues
Yeah.
that I was trying to write about in the book.
Yeah.
And so I said to my editor, well, let's send this to David Chase at HBO. And we're like, you think he's going to read this book? And I said, well, you never know, but let's send it to him. And unbelievably, he did. And
Yeah.
he, you know, blurbed it, and he requested copies for his screenwriters. And I think that helped get recognition because,
Yeah.
you know, there's so many good books written
Yeah,
about
there
Italian
are.
American experience,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it gets lost.
But just in general in publishing, you know, you said luck, it's 50% talent and 50% luck. I mean, it
Absolutely.
really is.
Absolutely.
Luck is really part of it. You mean, you know, talent is necessary, but it's also the luck, yeah. I just remember when the book first came out, you know, I just thought, wow, I was still in Indiana, and I just thought, wow. Okay, Italian Americans publishing with Norton. Little did I know that there were other Italian Americans publishing with Norton. There was a poet, one of our poets, Sandra Gilbert, who was publishing her poetry with Italian American. I only knew Sandra Gilbert as a critic, as a feminist scholar and whatever.
At Norton, my editor, Elaine Mason, is Elaine Salerno Mason.
Yeah.
And she is very interested in this kind
Yeah.
of literature, so that was wonderful.
Good.
And Elaine was just great to work with her on this last book. We had a lot of fun.
Well, we're looking forward for this because I know the book is printed because I saw advanced copies,
Oh, yes.
advanced proofs of it, so I know it's printed. We know the film is done because we had previewed it last spring at the Calandra Institute, and we're going to have, I think, many more conversations to come once the book is available. I think it's going to be out by the end of this year. The book.
The book is out
right?
in December 1st.
December.
Yes.
December
and the
1st.
documentary is
And
February.
then the document is February.
I believe February 17th
February.
is the first air date. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It was
and
a
we'll
pleasure.
talk to you soon.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let's go to the Calandra Institute for a conversation with Fred Gardefee. I thought today we can talk a little bit about the representation of Italians in the media. We can maybe go into the historical representation if we want, but we can also maybe talk about what's going on today. And the other most important thing is, what do we do with it? When we see something going on in the media that we don't like, how do we respond to it? Do we respond to it? Some organizations will say we don't respond to it at all. There are other organizations instead, their whole raison d'etre, or we might say in Italian, ragion d'essere, is to bring these to light.
I have a lot on this. In fact, I teach a course on Italian American film and images at Queens College on this. And what we have to understand, first of all, is that stereotypes are a necessary part of storytelling. The big bad wolf does not get a good reputation, you know. I've never seen a wolf that I've kind of like felt sorry for. And I think it's important to understand that requirement in storytelling, and that it's not so much who creates the stereotype, but who interprets the stereotype. Now, the images that are out there are images that people are using to sell something. It's about sales. If a dumb Italian or a gangster will make it work, they don't care. Even the Italian Americans who play these characters, they have a job, you know. As Tony LoBianco used to say, "Where's show me the schedal?" You know, I have to play some of these characters sometimes because I need the money in order to survive. Is it selling out? Some people will argue it is. Some people will say it's all that's out there. Do we need to protest? Yes. I think if we see something that is very offensive, we need to say we're offended by it. But at the same time, we need to do everything we can to put images out there that are more representative of what Italian Americans have contributed to this culture.
You have spoken ad infinitum.
I bet you didn't say ad nauseum.
You notice I paused,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It could have been.
Ad infinitum about bringing Italian American culture to the streets, and you always use that as one way in which we can educate better both the community at large, but also the Italian American community, right? Because we also find that there are those in the Italian American community who, on both sides of the aisle, perhaps can be better informed.
When I wrote this book, From Wise Guys to Wise Men, and there's a picture on the cover of the book of Amerigo Bonacera leaning into Don Corleone's ear, so many people complained that it was the stereotype. The title of my book, Dago's Red, people were just appalled by that title. They didn't even bother to open up the book and read either book. I had no choice as to that cover of the book. You know, the people at the press said, we want this. And I said, well, that's kind of stereotypical. Well, your book goes beyond this. I said, yes, it does go beyond the stereotype. Well, I said, but I think a lot of people are going to get stopped by that. As I learned earlier, a lot of people got stopped by the word Dagos in Dago Red. And my second book was called The Art of Reading Italian Americana, much more pleasant, much more inviting, and so on. So I think what has to happen is we need to get this information out of the books and into the people's minds. Now, I thought it was very simple. Let's write a book, and let's put it in the libraries, and let's tell people about it, and the people will read the books, and we'll be fine. Well, they don't read the books. When people are complaining today about the gangster image, they didn't read my book. Not to say that there is a be-all and end-all answer inside that book, but I think there's an explanation of why this occurs, and then what we need to do to change that. So I think what has to happen is people have to understand that there is more to processing the gangster image than complaining. And it has to do with interpretation. How do we create different ways of perceiving these stereotypical images so people understand that they're being used to manipulate you into feeling a certain way about a product? Very few Italian Americans create gangster figures because they feel Italian Americans are gangsters, or create buffoons, or create Guido-type caricatures. There is a certain sense of reality inside every stereotype that exists. That's what makes it, you know, viable, malleable, and in a sense you can change it. But there is some substance there. When that substance gets interpreted as being the only substance for a group, that's when we get into trouble.
Let me share an observation with you, and then you can react to it. 40 years ago, 1974, Richard Gambino wrote in Blood on My Blood that the Italian-American gangster, the mafia figure, was replacing the cowboy as the popular American icon. No more cowboys and Indians, which of course was already problematic in its own pairing, but now we have, of course, the gangster that is the American icon par excellence, according to Richard Gambino. Mario Puzo may have actually anticipated that in 1969 with The Godfather, right? Here was a guy who 5 years before had published a wonderful novel called Fortunate Pilgrim that many people have not read, yet he did the gangster, the Don Corleone. My own reaction to that is that The Godfather is a highly ironic piece of literature. Both as an idea, as a concept. We know the story, the anecdote. He wanted to make money. He didn't want to be a chooch, et cetera, et cetera.
And
indeed he made money. It's that sense of irony, perhaps, that we need to get to, right?
Right, and that's what I mean in terms of interpreting. People have to understand. How many people have complained about The Sopranos? I mean, I think there are issues with The Sopranos that one could create an argument to complain. But I think sometimes, simultaneously, there's a sense of irony being lost by the audience that the author or the director put into it. We have to understand this sense of irony. I mean, this is the subject of the next book that I'm working on, is this irony and humor. You know, when are we being funny? When are we not being funny? When do we feel we're being insulted? When are we being laughed at? Who can we laugh with? But in terms of this idea of the cowboy, you know, the opening scene of Fortunate Pilgrim has a young boy riding a horse down near the railroad tracks. It's almost like a cowboy,
right?
You know, and of course, the cowboy was this kind of male identity in the 1930s and 40s, especially. I mean, my grandfather used to say, Hopalong Cassidy, we'll call him Hopalong Quesadich, you know, and but there was this great identity, and some people like Gambino have gone on to say that, you know, the gangster is an extension of the cowboy. I would say that in terms of replacing the cowboy for popular attention, yes, but there is no connection, I think, between the cowboy and the gangster. Cowboy is an individual.
And I don't think that.
And,
It was just the idea that when you think of up until the late 60s and early 70s, when you thought of America, whatever, you think of the Wild West, you think of the cowboy, et cetera, as opposed to now.
Well, and then as society began moving from an agrarian to an urban culture, you know, it makes sense. And, you know, these are things that a lot of people have already written about, you know, not just my book, but there's books before me and there's been books coming out.
Yeah.
And I always wonder if people are reading, one, and two, if they are reading, are they understanding what they're reading? And especially when we talk about this idea of irony, because irony works only if you're clued in. It works in terms of understanding. It works in terms of misunderstanding against the very people that you're trying to make a comment. You know, so if somebody doesn't get your irony, those are the people you're talking about. And, you know, if you don't take something ironically, what is the alternative? Well, you take it literally. And I think this is when people take this to an extreme and protests that seem to go nowhere. I mean, Fiorello LaGuardia complained about Little Caesar and Scarface. The same kind of letters that were written, that are being written today by different anti-defamation groups within the Italian-American community. And are we getting anywhere?
So what's the answer?
The answer is, let's shift to profamation, is what I call it. Nobody seems to want to understand that word or use that word, but to promote the fame and the fortunes of Italian Americans. I think it's going to begin to happen. There's rumors that Coppola is working on a Italian American saga that no gangsters are in it. PBS.
And only Italian American actors. That's the other rumor.
Yeah, PBS is doing this series.
Right. 4-hour series.
Well, what began to change the images for the African Americans is when PBS did a 13-part series called Eyes on the Prize. Turns out the same group that worked on that is doing this PBS series. So this is what needs to happen. People need to see alternative images by which to compare the previous images. There's recent research that's being done on Italian American youth by Rosemary Serra, and some of the findings that she's let me privy to are that Italian American kids, they don't buy that stereotype. We're all afraid that our kids will become like that. Our kids are already more advanced. They're not buying that, the dumb stereotype, the gangster stereotype, the bimbo stereotype. They're not buying it. And so what that means is we need to know what is it that they are buying into, or how are they moving away, because that's the generation that's going to respond to these in the future. And not just respond, but also create. And so profamation means let's focus on what is positively being done and let's support. It didn't happen in the African American community until African Americans started producing their own films. Robert Townsend, Spike Lee, the list goes on. And once they started taking control of the presentation of their images, they could use stereotypes the same way that they can use the N word, like we can use the Dago word. Because people say, we know what we're saying. They can use it in ways to move beyond simple reactionary anti-defamation moves.
While you were talking, the other person I thought about was also Tyler Perry, who has perhaps really brought the African American into upper middle class, if not even higher, with a series of his movies in the last few years. You talk about Italian Americans really taking possession of the subject and dealing with it. But that's where we're lacking, isn't it? I mean, we don't have that type of cultural philanthropy that, and this is something I've spoken about, some people would say ad nauseum, right? But we don't have Italian American philanthropy to the same level that we do in other groups. And we also are very quick to compare Italian Americans and the treatment of Italian Americans to other groups, specifically African Americans and Jews. And I find that problematic.
Absolutely.
For a variety of reasons. Our histories are totally different, and ours is much less tragic than those other two histories. But it seems to me, my feeling is the answer is in philanthropy and in cultural philanthropy. When you say we need to make our own movies, it's not cheap to make movies. And so we have to make sure that there are people willing to invest in an Italian-American movie or a movie of Italian-American subject matter that is not mafia, machine guns, etc.
Right. Well, I mean, you could take a look at what's been going on with Jersey Boys. Jersey is a very heavy Italian-American production component to Jersey Boys, both the play and the film. But one group is not going to do it. We need 100 Jersey Boy producers to get out there and to find what's best and to create. When I used to teach high school, I would teach a creative writing course, and these kids would come into the classroom writing about prostitutes and all this. I said, do you know about? No, that's what I see on TV. So they were led to think that what was on TV was what people wanted to, and their own lives weren't worth writing about. Mm-hmm. Italian American kids never get anything about their own background in their education. And so how could they feel value in this material unless it's validated? We need to put this material in education so that all, not just Italian Americans, everybody understands what it meant to be, whether it was the Sacco and Vanzetti or the union movements or the workers who die in Christ in Concrete, who died building New York City, which is a buried, pardon the pun, story, a huge buried story. That we are not just victims, we are also perpetrators of the American dream. Because if you look at the earliest, when I was teaching a film course in Italian-American filmmakers, and I do use a few gangster films, just so students begin to see them in the context of all the others. My feeling has always been that when you look at the gangster in Italy, you look at it, the Italians look at it through a lens which says this is part of Italian culture. But when we look at it in the United States, we look at Italian culture through the gangster and we say this is Italian or Italian-American culture. We need to educate people to the whole spectrum of what Italian-American culture is, whether it's right-wing, left-wing, lifestyles, gay, lesbian, men, women, whatever it is. We need to be open to all that so that we have choices of how to interpret what we see.
But that's a complicated problem, and the comparison between organized crime in Italy and organized crime in the United States is also a complex comparison because the Italians live with it, they have lived with it. Right. It's part of their daily lives, whether it's the Camorra in Naples or the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and elsewhere, or the Mafia in Sicily, whatever name you want to give to it. Organized crime is, one could say, really insidious in Italy. People will say that in the United States, Italian-American organized crime is 0.01% of organized crime, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So how do we deal with that? The other issue is, let's talk about book publishing, because you and I have been involved in this for now 25 years. In November, we're going to celebrate 25 years of Bordighera Press, and we know it's not easy to get, it's easy today to get a book published. That's not a problem. But if the book isn't reviewed, and if, as your own experience in the past, you've been told that, yeah, this is a nice manuscript, but you need to put more mafia into it. Right. If a book isn't reviewed because it doesn't have that subject matter in it, what do we do?
By creating Bordighera Press and all the other presses that have grown up around this, this is a first step. I feel like the next generation is going to reap the benefits of what we've done. I never would have imagined back when I was in my 20s that there would be an Italian-American press. There wasn't an Italian-American press. It barely was a newspaper, and mostly it was, I used to read the Franoi to my grandfather, both in the Italian and the English, which is how I got to learn to pronounce Italian words, not dialects, because I'd read him. By creating these entities of producing, and I know, we can produce books, but how do we get them out there? We send them out for reviews, and sometimes we send them out for reviews and they say, why don't you send me something to write this review? They don't even know how to review books out there. So, the problem, I think, is this. We create the means of promotion.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's the way. And we have to let people know. I was sitting at the book fair the other day selling Bordighera books, and people came surprised to the table. They had never known there was an Italian-American person. I said, we're just one of a number that are out there. And they didn't even know that. And, we're at the end of this aisle, and it's outdoors, and maybe 500, 600 people walked by, you know, maybe 40, 50 people stopped and talked, but they're enlightened now. I think social media is doing it. I think the internet has been a fantastic way of beginning to put it out there. But it's not just writing the books and promoting the books. It's getting them into the classrooms, getting them into people, having people get into the process of giving books. I mean, you know, Iowa says read, write, and be written. Yes. So I think that, you know, these are all steps along the way that will also then enhance the ability of people to interpret beyond the stereotype.
And the national organizations, and some of them have actually promoted a good number of our books.
Sons of Italy has a book club.
Order Sons of Italy, NIAF has excerpted a couple of our books, and that membership, though, still needs to be tapped, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everyone who comes to one of their meetings should, you know, they should know about these books. I mean, I have gone to almost every organization I could possibly think of, and if you're out there and you want to invite me, I'll come to speak about literature, books, because even to this day, because we are not institutionalized, we're more institutionalized in terms of teaching and learning than we were 50 years ago, but we still have a long way to go.
Well, on that note, we still have a long way to go. We'll stop here because we're going to do this again probably somewhere not too far down the road. I'm sure about every maybe quarter, every semester, we'll revisit this topic.
Yeah, I think it's worth it.
And in the meantime, people can come and join our conversations at the Calandra Institute.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being with us.
Sure, thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this special episode of Italics. For more information on Italian Heritage and Culture Month events, go to italyculturemonth.org. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.
Sing, 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 sing. Everybody start to sing. La-di-da, ho, ho, ho. Now you're singing with a swing. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do- Yabadot,